Bulavinaka, I welcome you to another lesson for today. Today I will be discussing on Year 13 literature, specifically prose, short story, and under the theme love, there are two short stories. I will be discussing one of them, which is Harry by Rosemary Timberly. Just another reminder, whenever you are writing the authors of the works that you have studied, and also the titles, make sure the spelling is correct. The title needs to be quoted, so there are to be quotation marks. And the authors, poets, or dramas, the playwrights' names are to be correct. So Rosemary Timberly is the author of our short story one under the theme love. Without further ado, we will now discuss about the writer. Rosemary Timberly. Now, she was born on the 20th of March 1920 and died on 9th November 1988. She was a British novelist, short story writer, and screenwriter. She wrote a wide range of fiction, publishing 66 novels in 33 years and several hundred short stories, but is best remembered for her ghost stories, which appear in many anthologies. Her story, Harry, has been filmed several times. In the mid-1940s, while still working as a teacher, she started submitting short stories to magazines and newspapers, with the first Hot Air and Penelope being published in August 1946. Still writing, she left her job as a teacher to become a staff writer for Reveal magazine in 1949. Editing the personal advice column under the pen name Jane Blythe. Readers' letters and writing a number of stories, feature articles, and book reviews. And then after writing a number of novels, she left Reveal to become a freelance writer, going on to write a number of radio and television scripts. And that is a very short and brief biodata of our author, Rosemary Timberly. You can see that she has a great tenure. She has written, and most are of stories, and one of her famous stories is Harry, which will be discussed. Now we have the setting and background of our story. Now the story takes place in London, England. The main part of the story takes place in the Jameses' residence. It is summer, and although the sun shines brightly, the Jameses' home seems cold to Mrs. James. The ghostly presence of Harry seems to be having this effect. The James cannot have children they have adopted Christine and bring her up as their own. They seem to be well off and love Christine as if she was their flesh and blood. Mrs. James in particular is very attached to Christine, and her mother's instincts tells her that something is not right. Harry's family comes from the very poor side of town. The father is the sole breadwinner, and the wife has just had a second child. His father was laid off from work, and this drives him to kill his family as he cannot provide for them. In 1955, the year that Harry was written, a slum clearance act came into effect, and that meant that many who lived in these areas would be relocated. This is referring to the old lady who refused to leave her home. Harry's family lived in unsanitary conditions, which explained the father's long illness, which led to him losing his job. In many instances in my previous video, when I had discussed on the Kabuliwala, the year 12 short story, the setting and the background, however different, they both are tied together. The setting is the physical place where the story takes place, and the background is usually the political or the social atmosphere of the story. Our setting is in London, England. This is where the story takes place, the physical setting. However, the background, it also ties together with what is happening in the foreground and background. So it happened in 1955, a year where there was a slum clearance act in London, England, that where all those who lived in slums were relocated. And a character, the woman who tells Mrs. James about the fate of the little boy Harry and his family, she refuses to leave her home. So this all ties together to how it also affects how the story pans out. So if you've read the story, which I have, and it's a very interesting read, the first time I read it, I have I had goosebumps, and I still do whenever I read for my year 13s. It talks of an unlikely and strange horror story. Moving on, we have the plot, or the summary of the story. Now, when Mrs. James finds out that her 5-year-old daughter, Chris or Christine, is talking to an imaginary brother, she becomes scared and curious. As a foster mother of Christine, she is protective and mentions this to her husband. He, however, does not find anything wrong in it, but when Mrs. James tells him that Christine has a new accent the next day, he suggests that she should see Dr. Webster. After talking to Christine, Dr. Webster does not see anything wrong in Christine's behavior. She is told that Christine is expected to leave this habit when she joins school, and Mrs. James is glad that Christine will start school soon. Before going to school, Christine tells her mother that she doesn't want to go to school because Harry will leave her. After persuading her, she agrees. The next day, Mrs. James takes Christine to school and goes to the adoption registry. She asks Miss Cleaver about Christine's biological family. Miss Cleaver refuses to give her any information at first, but when Mrs. James explains her reasons, she agrees. She is told that Christine's parents were very poor. The father is the sole breadwinner who is struggling to make ends meet. When they have another child, Christine, things become even more difficult. One day, her father locks up all the windows and doors and turns on the gas. Christine's brother was able to break through the window to save Christine. After getting the address, Mrs. James goes to visit Christine's parents' home. The neighbor tells her about how Christine's brother, Harry, used to take care of Christine when her parents ignored her. She tells Mrs. James about how Harry falls to his death with Christine in his arms in a bush of white roses, where he used to sit and play with her. She also claims to see Harry's ghost coming back wanting to take Christine with him. Mrs. James suddenly realizes that she is running late to pick Christine up from school. When she reaches the school, she is told that Christine's brother had come to take her home. A search is mounted for Christine, but she is never found. Whenever I read this story to my students, and when we reach to that part where Harry picks up his little sister and they supposedly go off, it always leaves them wanting more. And I think that's the beauty of the story. It leaves us wanting more, and also you can have your own interpretation of what happens to Christine. So the story is full of mystery, it is full of horror, you get goosebumps, you're also wanting to know more. You share Mrs. James's struggle trying to understand why Harry is coming back for his sister. A supernatural entity is coming back to take a very live little girl, but you also want them to be reunited because the hardship that they had both endured, especially Harry. So yeah, the story is such, and it's a very interesting story. And if you think about under the theme love, Harry's love for his sister did make him go back to try and get back his sister for them to be together. So for in his mind, if his own biological parents couldn't love Christine, Mrs. James, who didn't birth Christine, wouldn't love her as much as he would. So I think that is his main motivator to why he wanted to take Christine with him. Now let's move on to the characters. So we're going to now discuss about the characterization of each character in our story. First we have the central character, which was Harry. Harry is Christine's brother. His physical appearance, as mentioned by Mrs. James at the beginning of the story, that really found her terrified of, which was red hair, and he is tall for his age. He speaks a Cockney accent of London. He loves Christine and saves her from death by jumping out of the window with her in his arms. So that talks about how selfless he is, and it is described how his mother neglected or had postpartum depression, so never actually showed any form of affection towards Christine. And that's where Harry would always be there for her. and even after death, he came back to rescue her supposedly from what he thought was a life that he wasn't in it. So he came to take her. He does, as a result, but comes back from the dead to take her with him. To understand Harry, one needs to understand his background of poverty and improvident parents. So the hand that was dealt to him really does show what type of person he was. And to be against all that adversity, he still showed love. And that love was mainly towards his baby sister. Now, this is probably why Harry turned to Christine as someone he could share his affections with, and as the little girl obviously adored him. Now, he probably felt that he owned her affections and wanted his little sister all for himself. He most probably didn't trust that Mrs. James loved Christine as much as he did. And that shows in the story where he kept wanting her attention and eventually leaves with her to go. We could only help but wonder. Our next character is Mrs. James. And Mrs. James is Christine's foster mother. She loves Christine as if she is her own child. And her instincts concerning Christine are well founded because she is proven correct at the end as her suspicions about Harry are confirmed. So Mrs. James, she's an intuitive person. Now sometimes we obviously, as a biological mother to children, we just assume that we know our kids more than anyone. But sometimes those who are adoptive parents, as mothers, we have this instinct that kicks in when our child is in danger. And another characteristic of Mrs. James is she does her best to give Christine a loving home and wants to protect her from the danger she senses in Harry, which is well founded because he does take her away. Now, please be reminded, Harry is a ghost, and to take Christine, who is still alive, into the supposed afterworld, how would he do that? And that would only be to kill her. So anyone can have their own theories about whatever happened at the end of the story. That's the beauty of literature, and that's the beauty of this story. Next character, we have Christine. Now, she is Harry's sister, who is now 5 years old and about to start school life. As she is the only child in the household, this is fodder for Harry, who was able to convince her